Hello, everybody. I'm Joseph Kopser, and welcome back to another edition of Catalyst Talks. I know it's been a while. As the world opened up again, we got busy, but it doesn't mean we don't still continue these conversations. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Dennis O'Neill and Greg Hiebert to talk about their newest book, which is called Changing Altitude, How to Soar in Your New Leadership Role. I couldn't be more excited, but I got to admit, in full disclosure, I have a pre-existing condition with both of them called years of friendship, which just make it even more special to be here. So, Dennis, Greg, how you both doing this morning?
Joseph, I'm doing great, but you have a lot more pre-existing conditions than just that.
Okay, we'll get into those later on. Greg, what about you? How you doing?
Doing great, Joseph. Thank you. That was a wonderful intro.
Well, you're on the move, so I don't want to necessarily guess where you're going, but generally speaking, where about in the country are you? And I see you're safely in the passenger seat, so where are you headed?
Heading from Atlanta to the North Carolina coast for some nice vacation.
Well-earned vacation. And that's the beauty of modern technology. So for the audience, if you're watching this live, it's Friday morning, the 29th of July, Friday. And it's about 10:15 in the morning. So start thinking about the questions you have for them. All of the description of the book and their biographies are in the comment section below. If you don't have it, we're going to briefly review their biographies, but we're going to do it during the discussion. And then in addition to that, this is live. So add your comments, tag people who you think are in positions of leadership that they're either new to or they're aspiring to a new level to, again, change the altitude of where they are in life and add them to this discussion. It's live on YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn all at the same time. So real quick, Denny, I guess I'll start with you. Why did you all write this book and who is it for?
Yeah, thanks, Joseph. We set out on this journey, I guess, a little over a year ago. And it really came out of one of our long-term existing clients. Is an individual who ran a large data analytics and consulting firm out of Chicago. And the parent company promoted him. And he went from running about 200 people in a $100 million a year company and really having one to having 6 different reporting groups. So he went from being an individual contributor with one organization to running a whole team of places where he was no longer the subject matter expert. And it was probably his first time where he was going to have people that knew more than he did about the individual roles, responsibilities, and clarity of the vision for each one of those. So as he became a group president, and he just really jumped up almost overnight, he just asked the question, what's out there? What can help me make these massive jumps that you do when you go from manager to director or director to vice president or, vice president to a regional president? And Greg and I did a lot of work, and, we found well over 1 million books on leadership, about half of them about how to be a great CEO and about half of them on how to succeed in your first job. And there was just a glut out there, almost nothing on how do you change roles and recognize that the adage that what got you here won't get you there, that there's a new set of responsibilities and a new set of requirements, and that you have to fundamentally develop yourself to work at that next level.
Yeah, you bring up a lot of great points there, Denny, that we'll unpack through all of this. But Greg, I know that you've not only written this book with Denny, but you had another book that you wrote a couple of years ago. And so I wonder, from your perspective, who did you write this current book for, similar to what Denny was answering? And more importantly, as you get into it, what stage in life are they in that will be most receptive to the thoughts in your book?
Thank you, Joseph. Great question. I really believe that the orientation of this book is for, and why we love the metaphor of changing altitude is when you go from 200 people to 2,500, as this client that Denny spoke of did, you go from overseeing an area that you may have deep expertise in to now overseeing a host of areas that it's impossible for you to have that expertise. And so our mindset is that as you move into a world that's much more complex, much more ambiguous, a world where you don't even know what you don't know, the way in which you lead has to change. And so the changing altitude was a metaphor for sort of getting out of your own head and experience to say, what is it that I've got to gain? What insights do I have to take on? What new capabilities and skills do I have to really hone and master in order for me to be as effective at this larger role, this larger scope than I was in my previous? So it's anyone who has made that leap that client had. And it could be, Denny and I love to tell the story about the forklift driver. This masterful forklift driver gets promoted to oversee 10 forklift drivers in his warehouse, 100,000 square foot warehouse. And then the poor warehouse manager has a heart attack, and upper management, their wisdom goes, hey, isn't that forklift leader, isn't he sharp? Let's make him charge of the warehouse. And overnight, you were master of the universe, because there was nothing that anyone could throw at you about forklift driving. But now, finance is asking for your budget on the 100,000 foot warehouse, and you go, what's a budget?
Exactly. Well, you bring up a great point, which we're going to turn into a little bit. And again, for those folks that have just turned in, we're talking about Greg and Denny's new book called Changing Altitude. I'll lift it up higher here on the banner. And it's really about that dilemma that they just described of the forklift driver. So first of all, I love the way the book is laid out. It's very simple to follow. But I also have to point out, in the very beginning, I read it online when it very first came out. But then when I saw the print edition and all of the comments and all the endorsements, that really is a who's who in leadership today in the United States. So well done. But let's talk about the first section. And you start by examining yourself. What are the takeaways from the book that listeners and viewers of this podcast should understand by what the gist is of what you're getting at when you talk about you and your role in this change of leadership, this change of responsibility? And either one of you can pick it up from there.
Yeah, I'll take the lead, I'll take the lead, Denny, and pass it on to you. I think one of the most important virtues of effective leadership is humility. Humility to look in the mirror, to see what's real about what you do know, what you don't know, and to admit to yourself first and foremost that there's some things you need to learn as you go from one level of responsibility to another. And so changing altitude is being able to sort of first have the courage to confront the reality of what you're good at and what you need to gain, what your strengths are. My good partner and colleague Denny knows that I've got a lot of strengths, but I've got some rough edges, in particular around organization. And I love being spontaneous, which has its strengths, but at the wrong time can be devastating. So,
and I want to point out too, though, just real quick for the reader, that really comes through in your book. You two kind of lay it out on the line with your own personal stories of those challenges. So you don't just talk it, you all walk it as well. Well said. So Denny, what do you say to that point?
So I appreciate that. And I think Greg's right. It's about self-awareness and the willingness to be able to be reflective and to understand that there's probably things that we've done really successful in the past. And I also argue that just about everybody has an opportunity for growth. And this book walks through how you might utilize those opportunities in a more focused way. And by that, I mean, I oftentimes tell clients that, we see ourselves as a reflection in the mirror, and we think that's pretty accurate. But I propose that oftentimes other people, our bosses, our peers, our subordinates, see us more like a portrait. And they get a lot less of that immediate reflection, but they see snapshots. And when there is a disconnect between those two images, between the mirror and the portrait, then there's space to learn and to grow and to use this self-awareness as a tool to help close those gaps.
Yeah. That section of the book talks about feedback, and not everybody, as we know, is receptive to feedback. I luckily, when I was a cadet at West Point, which we all three share in common, had a classmate named Bill Snyder who came into my room. We were early on in our freshman year. He shut the door. He pulled his chair up next to mine. He said, Joseph, I just got to tell you, I know you're well-intended, but everybody thinks you are a jerk. And boom, that hit me just so hard. But what was great about it was rather than just immediately get mad, I wanted, probably because I was still in shock, to just hear him out. And all of his points were valid. And I could see, to what you were saying, Denny, what I was thinking and seeing in myself and what others were seeing in me, two totally different things. So talk a little bit more about how you get that feedback, how you use that feedback. What does that look like, literally, figuratively, that the reader should take away?
Can I build on that, Joseph?
Please, please.
I had a role as a corporate head of HR for a pretty significant business unit, and I, part of the instituting, I was the guinea pig to take the lead on getting feedback about my leadership, and I held a pretty high opinion of myself, so I was devastated that my colleagues, especially my direct reports, said, you have a lot of strengths, Greg, but one of the worst the things you need to work on is you don't listen well. I get very passionate about things, and sometimes I can fill the space with my passion and forget that there's other people around me. And so getting that feedback and acknowledging that feedback and going back to my direct report saying, boy, this was a huge, sort of taking that on. And what's remarkable is, for the last 21 years as an executive coach, I've made a pretty good living listening to people. So it can be taught, it can be learned, but it begins with the courage to confront, where you need to improve and get better at.
Yeah. So Denny, what do you say about feedback?
I put a LinkedIn article out a week or two ago, and I think it speaks very much to this. And it captured a phrase from Greg that we use in the book that said, God gave us one mouth but two ears. And I think that's a story that came out of Greg's elementary age. And it's just really that notion that, so much of effective communication boils down to being a better listener. So Greg and I teach quite often that there's multiple ways that people listen. One I'll say is passive, and that is, I hear what you're saying, but my mind's just somewhere else. Yeah, you're talking, but I'm thinking about having a cheeseburger for lunch. Or the second one is what I'll call kind of reactive listening, and that is I'm reacting to what you're saying. So instead of focusing on what you are trying to tell me, I focus on how I'm going to rebut you and prove you wrong. And in doing so, again, we don't listen very effectively. Where we can develop our capabilities in being the third style of a generative listener, where we come in when we genuinely believe that this person is relevant and important and they have something to share, and we're going to learn here. And by being a generative listener, we create a much better dialogue that becomes deep and rich in that two-way conversation, rather than just hearing but not understanding, or rather than just talking and not listening. Mute.
It's going to take her 8 pounds of fluff and protect us from whatever delivery person was there. Okay, so let me build on that idea of active listening and illustrate it with a point. And Denny, you know this probably better than anybody, but it just so happens Denny and I worked for the same boss, a guy named George Casey, who was either the world's biggest extrovert of an introvert or the biggest introvert of an extrovert. He could talk in front of a crowd of 20,000 people at a huge conference, but then also be just as good as not talking to anybody for a couple hours, saving that energy. And by the way, we're going to get into energy management, but he was actively listening in those meetings to the point where during Q&A, so actively listening, it wore him out and he was having to regain his energy for the next 45 minutes. So talk a little bit about what that active listening is and maybe go a little bit more depth on that. And either one of you can pick it up, Denny or Greg.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at that, Joseph. I think Denny used the operative words that we try to teach from. We call it generative listening. And it begins with the first and foremost, the clear intention that says that the most important thing that's going to happen in our conversation, our dialogue, is shared understanding. And you can't get to shared understanding without being an active listener, being a generative listener, is to take a stance that said what the other person has to say to me matters, has value, and if I listen intently enough, something good is going to happen. And so begins with an intention, and it just can continual reminder to stay in it, stay in it, stay in it. There's nothing more important than the present moment now, because too oftentimes when we're poor listeners, we're, instead of me really listening to you, I'm preparing of what I'm going to say.
Yeah.
I think if
I didn't mean to cut you off, but I just wanted to illustrate of the people we know and the bosses we have as sports that do exactly what you just described. Jenny, did you want to add one more thing? If not, I was going to move on to the next section.
No, I was just going to add to, that's part of understanding the full perspective. And so often as we rise in an organization, it gets harder and harder to get information from the peripheries. And, the challenge then is, how do we come down off the balcony? And again, that metaphor of changing altitude just resonated with us, that, there's some times where we are working at the very top, but we also have the ability to come back down and see things from other people's perspective. So much of that generative listening style technique and exercises are around helping us get a better full perspective.
Yeah. And again, for those who haven't read the book, I really encourage you to get into it, because if you can just work on just that one skill, not only do I think it'll help in business or in leadership and teams, it might also help in marriage too. I'm just putting that out there. So, okay, let's talk about the next section of your book. When you talk about your people, talk about the people and values and the organization and what it means when you're trying to think about how you adapt your leadership style to a new level. First, we focused on yourself now, or the concept of self. Now let's think about your people. What do you want the listener to take away in that aspect?
I'll begin. I think the most important is beginning, again, just like I talked about in active listening, a place of intention. And good leaders begin with an intention to say that the people that I lead, that I'm entrusted to hopefully make a difference in their lives because of my leadership, I have to begin that each person has unique value. Each person has a unique story. Each person has a journey that they're on. And I think one of the most impactful, important things you can do right from the start is to make sure that the people you lead know that their story matters to you. And I remember my biggest failure as a young lieutenant was my boss's boss, who played a critical role in my evaluation, asked me to come brief him on my 35 young paratroopers, and I came up and I could talk through every element of their performance as soldiers. But he began to ask me personal questions like, what's this young soldier's story? He's got a Vietnamese name. He must have a story about how his family came to America. I said, sir, I don't know. And then another soldier says, that's a unique name. Where's he from? Well, I think he's from Houston. Well, what's his story? Well, sir, I don't know. And to General McNeil, who went on to 4 stars credit, he gave me a do-over. He says, Hiebert, you've got a month to get your act together, because it's clear you only know about what your soldiers can do in their jobs. You don't know anything about them in their personal lives. So you got 30 days. And I went to work, and I became a journalist. And I said, I'm going to write hometown press releases on every one of my soldiers about who they were. And so my soldiers were a little intrigued when Lieutenant Hiebert sat down with a big pad of yellow legal paper and started interviewing them. But I will tell you, the performance of that unit changed dramatically when those guys knew that I knew their stories.
Yeah. Well, it speaks to a great quote. And before I get to that quote, I just want to say to AJ, who left that comment, yes, we will put the link to the book inside of the comment section. Nora, who's producing this episode, will do that hopefully in between comments, but she's moving all kinds of stuff around with lots going on. And to Miles Murray, good to see you in the audience. Quite a long storied history with the folks that you see on the screen right now. And a great example, by the way, of changing altitude. Miles now a very successful CEO after leaving the Army, went to USAA, and now on the move. But to your point, Greg, about knowing your soldiers, years ago, I had a brief moment in running for Congress, and I remember someone pulled me aside and said, Joseph, every one of these things you're talking about are policy and it's wonky and sure you know the digits and how much power, but did you ever tell a story of a person impacted by these policies you want to change? And it just hit me like a brick. I'm like, holy crap, you're exactly right. Because to your point, Greg, people don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. So, Denny, I want to give you a chance to speak on that section of the book, talking about your people, and anything else you want to add based on what Greg said.
Yeah, we coach quite often that the bedrock of all high performance teams starts with trust and respect. If you look at Patrick Lencioni's book on the 5 dysfunctions of a team, he uses a pyramid model. The bottom of that pyramid is trust, and I say trust and respect because I think the two go hand in hand. The only way to build trust with somebody is really to get to know them as a human being, and the opportunities are almost endless if we look for those. Greg brought out a great point about getting to know your people. That is so powerful and all too often rare in organizations. We see kind of a different style of leadership, where people are treated either as a commodity where they're dispensable, or they're treated as part of a team and they're wanted and they need to be there. And the outcomes of those two styles of organizations are just so clear that as hard as you push when you treat people around quarterly revenue cycles and you hire or fire at will just based on today's profit, that lack of investment in the long-term growth of an organization is just always an Achilles heel. But when we treat people like that they matter and that we know them and that we are willing to share our own personal strengths and struggles through a bit of humility, then we really start that foundation of building trust that's so critical to move on to any high performance team.
Yeah. And I think what's amazing is that companies are really struggling, organizations struggling, trying to figure out how to teach the skills of how to invest time in people to get to know them, to your point, to look for those opportunities, which you are right, are countless. And as I was going through the book and I was getting into that section and reading about it, I remember distinctly saying to myself, well, what they're talking about here is leadership, and specifically mentorship, and be able to grow that bench, to be able to provide that two-way street, that connection. And I'm reading it and I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is mentorship. I'm all about it. And then I have to say, you two very pleasantly surprised me when I turned the very next page and you referred back to the body of work that I had been working on from the concept of mentorship, that not everybody gets it. And that's because oftentimes, and this is shameless self-promotion, I apologize, but that paper, what I tried to peel out is that there's a lot of people who don't even know what mentorship is. There's a lot of people who think it's brown nosing or it's networking or has a negative connotation, or I don't have a mentor. How do I do it? And what I'm not only thrilled about is that you all highlighted the concept of mentorship, but I had just recently on another Catalyst Talks episode like this one met Janice Omedeki, the founder of the Mentor Method, trying to help large companies at scale create those programs through a double-blind matching system to allow, Denny, to what you're talking about, is for just another way to get to know people. So love it. Love every bit of it. And I appreciate you guys giving me the shout out in the book. So let's move to the third section of the book, which is the environment. Perhaps one of my favorite sections, because you get into the almighty concepts of conflict and the paradoxical leadership of how you manage the fact that you can't control everything in your environment. So who wants to take a swing at that and give a couple of takeaways from the book?
Well, I'll take the lead, but I do want my good partner to weigh in, because he's got some fantastic thoughts about environment that the book reflects on in terms of his battle experience in Mosul. But yeah. I want to begin with, when I had the privilege to teach leadership at West Point, I felt that there was a strong body of knowledge out there that said, if you read these books on leadership, you'll be a better leader. And sadly, as Denny pointed out, there's a million books on leadership, and I think we still lack for great leadership at points, because just reading a book does not make you better. And I think every time I walked into that classroom, I wanted my young men and women to understand that if they responded as a leader instinctively, they would respond from their own needs. And so one of the most important things was certainly getting to know your soldiers and being able to read them, to know their strengths, to know where they needed to grow and develop, and what motivation works for one may require something different for another. But probably the most important thing we can do is be able to read sort of the environment, to understand who are the stakeholders here, what's the culture, what are the underlying assumptions of what's really going on here, how do you define success, what are the metrics they use, what are the ways in which they evaluate talent, and the more that you can read the room and interrogate reality, the more effective you're going to make decisions and be able to solve meaningful problems in a way that is lasting and sustainable.
Yeah. No, well, reading the room is key. In fact, Denny, before we jump into yours, we've got a question, Nora, if you can bring it up, from AJ. And I put my reading glasses on here, sign of age. So what have you found as a good incentive for leaders to work and improve themselves in the current economic climate? And what are good incentives or triggers to make leaders want to change? Anybody want to jump on that real quick while we got AJ's question up?
Yeah, so I think I'll probably start with the second part of that, which is change management. And if we look at understanding the environment through a change management lens, the first thing is always there's got to be a compelling need for change. As a psychologist, I point out to clients that the number one cause of stress in life is change. It might be a new job, a move into a new house, loss of a dear relative. All those are just major change events that cause stress. And in general, people don't naturally like to live in a stressful way. Therefore, the natural state is towards stability. So there has to be a trigger for that change. And I call that a compelling need. And as you think through John Kotter's 8-step change model or anything else, it has to be that recognition that the status quo is just not ideal. So in the book, I go through what I call kind of understanding the environment, that, in a volatile, uncertain, complex, ambiguous environment, just a difficult environment where I haven't seen before, or there's no book answer, or there's just an opportunity. I need a starting point. So I'm all about frameworks. So the framework I use in the book is just kind of a 5-step wheel that starts with, what's going on today? What does a better tomorrow?
Did we lose him? Oh, there you go. We got the first one. We got what is better tomorrow, and then we lost him.
And so if we start with what's going on today, then it takes that self-awareness to step back and say, what the bad and the ugly about the environment. And I was at a coaching meeting this morning at a huge healthcare center in Virginia, and we spent quite a bit of time really around having better and more effective communications, because this individual is having a really hard time articulating why is the current environment not good enough. And once we talked through the need for change and helped him develop the communication strategy around that, I just saw the light bulb go off, because he then became able to articulate not only how do I see it today, but how do I articulate a vision of a better tomorrow? Oftentimes in the military, that was called the commander's intent, in terms of how do I articulate, when all else fails, what does success mean, so that I can empower subordinates to make decisions on their own, because they understand the goals of the broader organization and the team.
Yeah. And Greg, do you want to pick up at all on the other part of AJ's question about incentives and how you kind of align them together so it's a win-win?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, AJ. I've been pondering on it's a challenging one, because when I begin with incentives, I think intrinsic versus extrinsic. And I want to first begin with the intrinsic. I was thinking about it's probably an overused trait, quote from Wayne Gretzky, the great one, who said to the best hockey players, always skate to where the puck is going to be. And Denny and I have the privilege of coaching a CEO who's trying to inject sort of a new change in his organization, and it's to anticipate problems and to move from being less reactive and more proactive. And so, going back to leadership growth, the more that we can make ourselves indispensable, that we're looking around the corner, not solving just today's challenges, but reflecting on how we can take on tomorrow's challenges. I think we make ourselves indispensable. We grow our own capabilities, and so intrinsically we grow. Extrinsically, I think our leadership is looking for people who are willing to step up into much more proactive oriented leaders. So I think there's a win-win-win. Win for you, win for the people you lead, and certainly win for the organization.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I want to make sure I get that to a concrete level for AJ, because I think that's really deep insight, Greg, and very rich. So, when we think about what we want out of a team or an organization, it's the engaged employees. Gallup does the employee engagement survey every year. They have 28 million data points that come out every year. And it's just clear to me that the secret sauce boils down to three major components on what I'll argue are incentives. The first one is, do people feel that the work that they do matters? Do they believe that it has a positive impact? The second one is, do they feel valued then for that work that they do? And then the third one is, do they have positive relationships with peers in the workplace? And, if we have employees that feel like the work they do matters, they feel appreciated for that work, and that they are being able to build positive relationships, those are really the incentives. I'm not talking about money. I'm not talking about that intrinsic. I'm talking about what really motivates people. The great literature out there on the happiness hypothesis that it's not successful people that are happy, it's happy people that become successful.
Right.
And we underestimate the size of that emotion in decision making and in processing. And frankly, paying people more doesn't generally make them happier. There's a minimum, obviously, about minimizing stress, but when you focus on people knowing what they do matters, that they feel value for that work, and that they build positive relationships, those become the incentives to build high performance organizations.
Yeah, I've often said that friends at work make work more friendly, and it's just creating that climate. But so let's take it back to where we were when AJ's question came in the third section of your book, talking about the environment. We talked about conflicts and paradoxical leadership, and Greg gave his example. But Denny, I know, as Greg pointed out, that you have a very powerful story in that section about your experiences in Mosul, Iraq, while in the Army. Do you want to tell listeners just a little bit about that? I mean, obviously, I recommend the book itself to get into, but just share a little bit about that story in the context of the environment and this changing of altitude and leadership.
Sure. So, if you go back to that framework I started with, step one of that was, what's going on today, i.e., what is the environment that we're operating or dealing with? And, I had an 11-man special missions team working and training and embedded with 5 Iraqi battalions in Western Mosul in 2008, 2009. If anybody knows a little bit about the Iraq War history, that was not a pleasant place. It was the Wild West for all intents. So, what's going on in the environment, if you ask the question, you were never going to get the answer. Nobody was ever going to say, well, this area is good, this area is bad, unless they were trying to do it for self-serving reasons. So I developed what I called the term the proxies of the environment, and how do we read the environment when nobody absolutely understands or will tell you the ground truth. So, for example, you just had to come up with the things that you could use. So things like, How late would a grocery market stay open on the street or street vendor carts in the evening? You know, if every street vendor was off the street by 3 p.m., there was probably some pretty significant issues we needed to look at. If they're willing to stay out after dark when people got off work and they were still selling their goods, then that was probably a pretty good indicator of safety and stability. You know, what time were the kids walking to school in the morning? If kids were walking to school between 7 and 8, probably was a pretty good neighborhood. If there was nobody on the street early mornings, we probably needed to make sure we put some more resources in there. So a long story about understanding the environment, but much of it is just recognizing that on face value, we may not know. And we have to come up with our alternative approaches to get information from the peripheries. And the higher we go, the harder that oftentimes gets, because you become more detached from the people actually doing the work, the people actually producing the results, whether it's, you know, I come from an industrial manufacturing background as well. You know, if you don't get down to the shop floor and look at the individuals that are actually making the material, you probably don't have really good insight to be able to have the discussion with the board about the future direction of the company. So it's that ability to span and to answer where are the gaps in the knowledge when the environment is very difficult to read.
Yeah. Before I react to that, I want to remind folks, if you're watching this live Friday morning, the 29th of July, feel free to drop any more questions that you might have before we close up here in a few minutes.
Can I make one point, Joseph?
Oh, Greg, jump in. Absolutely. Jump in.
Just, you know, Stephen Covey wrote that amazing book many, many years ago, The 7 Habits of Highly Effective Leader. If you know, if there's one truism of leadership that Denny and I so deeply try to remind our clients and remind ourselves, is this notion of seek first to understand before being understood. And the human tendency is to simplify and to jump to conclusions and to judge very quickly without fully appreciating what really is going on. And so if I can offer just one impassioned plea, you know, write it down somewhere so you go back to it. Seek first to understand before being understood. You know, it wasn't Einstein, but one of his colleagues said that to every complex problem is a simple solution, and it's usually wrong. Complex problems require complex solutions.
Oh, if only it was that easy. But you both just said something that, you know, kind of made me think about how certainly, you know, civilians who have never had any experience in combat and maybe couldn't necessarily relate specifically to that, Denny, but they have plenty of opportunities in their own world. And my favorite example is the break room or the break area or the kitchenette or whatever inside of a workspace where a lot of people are. That to me is one of my favorite examples. The dead giveaway is, does this organization care or have culture if the trash can's overflowing, the sink's full of dirty dishes, the fridge has got years old moldy food in it? It means that nobody cares and everybody thinks that's somebody else's problem. But in contrast, you walk into those organizations where it's maybe not, you know, spotless, but it's put away, because if someone sees someone left something out, they put it in the dishwasher. Something didn't quite make it in the trash can, they'll pick it up and put it in. And I think that just speaks volumes. So, well, as we transition here, we've already reached the end of the time. We got a couple minutes left if any other questions pop in, but I want to ask the question that allows you all to fill in the gap. What did we not discuss? There was something about the book or the mission or the purpose of writing this that we didn't talk about that you want to drive home.
Yeah, I'll take that to start, Greg. The one thing that kind of ties that understand yourself, your people, and the environment kind of back together is this notion about, you know, getting to know the people on your team, and then using your ability to flex your leadership style based on your understanding of the individuals. You know, it's not a one size fits all process, but the better we know our people and we can meet them where they're at, the more likely we are to understand what motivates them, what are their incentives, and therefore we can align our approaches and our styles with the needs. All too often, you know, we expect the people that are working for us to adjust to us. And I can't even count how many times I've heard some aspect of well, that's just who I am. But being humble
Oh, yeah.
enough and self-awareness enough to look at it and say, you know, not how do I want to be treated, but how would this person want to be treated, is just so important towards that building that bedrock of trust, to be able to initiate any change management process that includes not only compelling need, but compelling vision that people understand clearly because they get your intent. And then, you know, working through what does it look like to build a team around that of successful, engaged employees. And, you know, clearly there's a few military examples in the book. There's a lot of historical examples. There's nonprofit examples, corporate examples. So it's certainly not written for a military audience per se. It is written by two former military guys, but it's written as a framework to help people understand how do they take these abstract, some of the abstract comments or content and apply it to their individual lives in a way that matters, with a whole series at the end of each chapter on ways to reflect, ways to grow, ways to improve, and really figuring out what are the one or two or three things that I'm going to do differently that are going to make me better and therefore make those around me even better.
Well said. And my favorite part, I think, in what you said is what I heard in there is that there is hope for old dogs to learn new tricks if they're willing to apply themselves. So I appreciate that optimism. Greg, what about you? What did we leave out that you want to drive home?
There's a quote I think of all the time. It's your actions are screaming so loudly I can't hear what you're saying. and in the book we go into great detail about the concept of authenticity, and we describe it as the space between what you espouse as your values and what you actually practice and live, and the least space there is when there's no distance between those two. That's when leaders create extraordinary authenticity and credibility for those they lead. But you know, it has to begin with that self-awareness to be able to have the courage to explore, is there space? How am I really showing up for others? And I think the journey of great leadership is certainly about confidence, but informed by humility. And so my challenge to the readers and my challenge to anyone listening to this is, you know, do you have the courage to really look in the mirror and to look in the portrait to see, am I the kind of leader that I want to follow? Am I being the kind of leader who inspires me and inspires, have the courage to actually do something about it?
Well said. So as we wrap up here, I want to thank both of you for being on this latest episode of Catalyst Talks. For those who have just tuned in, maybe at the end, or maybe you're watching this later on, it's a book I highly recommend. Again, Changing Altitude. It's really an exploration of yourself and others and the environment for how you do make that comprehensive change, or to have those tools for both personal and professional growth. And for me, the biggest takeaway of all of this, probably, Greg, was one of the last things you said, which is, and that quote that I love, and I will use it a lot, which is that your actions are screaming so loud, I cannot hear what you're saying. So to both of you, thank you very much for being on Catalyst Talks. Those of you that have tuned in, I see, Keela, we got one last comment. Oh, thank you, Keela. We loved it too. What a great comment and way to end. But with that said, thank you for tuning in to Catalyst Talks. Find more information about both Greg and Denny in LinkedIn. Follow them and their work. And by all means, reach out to me, Joseph Kopser from Grayline Group, or, as we mentioned earlier, the mentor method, if you want to talk about mentorship at scale in your company. So, gentlemen, thanks for being on this morning, and safe travels, Greg, for you and Claudia. And Denny, look forward to seeing you soon.
Thank you, Joseph. Thank you.
Well done.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.